Hi, my name is Katja Vogt and I teach philosophy at Columbia University.
Hi, my name is Jens Haas and I'm a photographer and artist.
Philosophers are very interested in what we can imagine and what we cannot imagine, what are the limits of the imagination. I always think that movies and artwork in general help us extend the imagination. What I find super interesting about Only Lovers Left Alive, this movie by Jarmusch, is that it really sort of turns around the whole genre of vampire movies, where usually the audience, you're scared of the vampires. So you take the perspective of the potential victim, you take the perspective of the person who may be bitten and who is in danger. Whereas in that movie, we take the perspective of the vampires, and we should sort of share their worries, we share their concerns of, running out of quote unquote supplies, as they call blood. And so we are approaching their life from their point of view, and that kind of change in perspective, I think, is a wonderful way of just extending what we can imagine.
I think I was just remembering this leap of the imagination that we all took when we were preparing the film, of trying to grasp what it would be like to have lived for that length of time and to have access to that back catalogue of music, all the things that they have in their houses. And I think, it made us question how hidebound we all are encouraged to be in terms of our generation or our time or our decade or whatever. And once you imaginatively release yourself from that, it's, you get a kind of free fall into imagining what it is to be, in my case, 3,000 years old, in Adam's case, 500, where Schubert is that guy I talked to the other day. That whole feeling of span, it's a heady feeling, but once you start to chew on that root and you get used to it, which is where we were at while we were shooting, it gives you this amazing feeling of being able to sample not only decades but centuries. And I think that generally speaking, we don't encourage ourselves to do that. But you know what? We can. And somebody who's really helping us do that is YouTube, of course. We can go back there thanks to YouTube, not only in terms of music, of course, but also in terms of lectures. And we can really forget that we're only living now, or we're only looking at what the latest colour supplement told us was the in thing this week.
She makes it seem as if the big difference here is that they have been alive for so long, that she's been alive for 3,000 years and her male partner protagonist in the movie for 500 years. Of course, for the audience, it could seem like the big difference is that they are vampires rather than human beings. So that's an interesting angle to say that is actually what for her was the sort of leap of imagination, that she's been alive for such a long time.
I can keep a secret. You should know that. But I ask you, the most outrageously delicious literary scandal in history.
Here, Eve, that was 4 centuries ago.
You've been wearing that waistcoat for 4 centuries.
I too find interesting that in this Tilda Swinton quote, vampires don't figure, because after watching the movie again and then again, I wonder if it's even about vampires. I mean, it's obviously about vampires because the plot is driven by the continuous craving of blood, and no blood means death. But one could also look at the movie as a love story. And here is this couple. They've been together for centuries and they deeply love each other. They know each other's quirks, they know each other's insanities, and still they are in love as if it's the first day.
Checkmate, my darling.
Eve, you're ruthless. You're brutal.
I'm a survivor, baby.
This is both in the movie, I think, but also there are lots of deleted scenes that are on the DVD. And there's, for example, one, they are in bed and talk to each other, and she asks, "Do you even change your sheets?" And he says, "Yes, I do. I changed them last year." And so there's this constant play with the vampire theme, and it dominates the movie throughout.
You do know that it's very bad luck to cross a threshold without being invited.
Are you still afraid of garlic?
But the ingenious thing I think about this vampire movie is that it's a complete switch of perspectives. To my knowledge, it's one of the first vampire movies that is done from the perspective of the vampires and not from the perspective of a threatened human being. The normal human beings, us, are zombies. And you identify throughout, from the first scene to the very end, the vampires, and you look at the flask of blood turning over and you think, oh no, the blood is lost, do something. So that's all there, but one concern about watching this vampire movie is you can't, I think, watch other vampire movies because they look so terribly dated, even the great ones, because of this switch of perspective.
We got high, told stories about monsters and vampires.
Ooh, scary fictions.
One thing that is interesting also about Tilda Swinton referring to all the sort of access to culture that one would have if one was 3,000 years old. It seems to me that Jim Jarmusch, in making that movie, is also kind of looking at philosophy quite a bit. Some of it is very explicit, and he is sort of unashamed in doing a kind of hit list of the canon, referring to everything, to Einstein, to Newton, to Schubert, to, you know, the hit list of people in music and science and in poetry and literature, and in music, of course. But philosophically, I think he also refers to a lot of things. For example, in philosophy, people are very interested in zombies. And there's almost a technical notion of what a zombie is in philosophy, and that is a being that doesn't have an inner life. So a being that you would be interacting with, and it kind of looks like us, but it isn't, because it doesn't have a mind, it doesn't have feelings, it doesn't have thoughts, it doesn't have an inner life. And so it's really interesting when Adam, the male vampire, calls us human beings zombies. And one thing he says is, you know, they are so scared of their imaginations, and he kind of charges us with not having an inner life.
And their fear of their own fucking imaginations.
My darling.
So they kind of think that they have this really rich and interesting inner life, and human beings are these kind of dead beings with far less imagination, far less going on in their heads. And I suspect that Jarmusch was sort of playing with this discussion in philosophy, where the question is, can we imagine what it would be like not to be conscious, not to have the kinds of mental states that we have? Well, and here's some kind of other creature, a dead creature, an undead creature, a vampire, that says, well, we are the zombies. We are the kinds of beings that don't really have an inner life. And that struck me as very interesting, as a kind of additional, almost quote of contemporary philosophy. I guess you could say that someone who has the experience of having lived for 3,000 years or for 500 years, of course, has much more experience than any possible human being could have. And then compared to them, we must seem like children, or it must seem like there's just not a lot in our heads. You know, we don't have that amazing conversation with Schubert or with Shakespeare or whoever. And both of them sort of live very much in an artistic environment. She's a lover of books. In her place where she lives in Tangier, she has piles of books everywhere. At some point, he is kind of suicidal, and they have this conversation through various technological gadgets, which aren't quite Skype, but some version thereof. And so then she decides she's going to visit him, and when she packs her suitcase, it's just a pile of books, nothing else. And he lives in this place in Detroit, in some neighborhood where houses are empty and people have left, and his house is full of old instruments, music, keyboards, whatever. So they both live very much in a kind of world of art that they have created, and they have somehow assembled that world throughout centuries and maybe even millennia.
Yes, along these lines, you could say that there is a similarity between vampires and artists. You could even say that Jarmusch fashions himself at this point after a vampire with the dark clothes and the big white hair and the kind of, well, a little bit intimidating figure that he may come across as.
You know, I've spent a lot of my life, and I continue to try to learn how to use this form, this beautiful form. I love movies so much, and I love making them, and I love the form So what I've been trying to learn for all these years is how to say something on a screen. So that's my preferred state, way to express something. So then to say, well, what did you want to say about it? Well, I kind of said it on there, I used that form. So talking about it, I feel sort of inarticulate, confused, confusing, so I don't know.
I think there is a strong sense of life imitating art and art imitating life in this movie. I mean, Adam, the male protagonist, is a version of Jarmusch who is he seems to be a real reclusive person who at the same time seems to want to be secretly famous. He wants his work out. That's something he's talking all the time, his music.
I know you don't want to play live. I know you want to remain completely anonymous, but you being so reclusive and everything is probably only going to make people more interested in your music.
Yeah. What a drag.
I didn't know it at the time. In 2015, I flew down to Knoxville, Tennessee, in, I think, the smallest commercial airplane I ever saw. And people were still boarding. I was sitting there looking up, and right next to me sits Jim Jarmusch. And I didn't know anything about the movie at the time, and I barely knew that he had a band. He still does. And so he was sitting there and looking out the window, and there was this conveyor belt type thing pointed at the airplane and loading the luggage, and the luggage mainly included the instruments of the band, and he was looking outside. He was totally excited about it, like a child. And that's, I think, what characterizes his films, that he has this childlike awe of very simple things, and he keeps looking at them with a photographer's eye. And there is not a lot of plot or action in his movies, but there is such an amazing attention to detail. The other thing in that airplane that I found odd, of course I'm thinking, well, next to me there is Jim Jarmusch. Should I ask him something? Or well, I probably shouldn't, because that's annoying. So what I did instead was texting a friend back in Europe. And she was online, and she texted right back, and I asked, guess what? I'm flying out of New York. I'm sitting right next to Jim Jarmusch. Should I ask him something for you? And she's a reclusive person as well, so she didn't want me to ask him anything. But for 2 hours, there was this interesting interplay of, okay, here sits this famous person. He doesn't have the kind of fame to fly around in private planes, so he has this exposure to people like me. And thinking about talking to him, and of course he has these antennas to know that people recognize him but don't quite know what to do with it. So for 2 hours there was this interplay of him celebrating himself in a way, reading an old newspaper. I think it was some local thing. It wasn't even a real newspaper, but he read it from the first page to the last page. He didn't have any gadgets. I was sitting there with my smartphone. I didn't know about the movie at the time. In hindsight, I thought, okay, he just did a movie about this travel experience of people looking awkwardly at him and he pretending not to notice. And that's the story of Adam, in a sense, in the movie. He is this artist. He wants his work to be out there, as he puts it. And at the same time, he doesn't want to deal with all the rest of it. He doesn't want to be famous. He doesn't want to have intruders in his life. And I think you have this theme throughout the movie. For example, the LUMIERE thing, the dream airline for any reclusive artist, where no one sits next to you, there are no crying infants. That's something I think that you can criticize about the world that Jarmusch creates. There are never any children. There are never any people who are not, in a sense, artists or related to art. It separates this world from a lot of humanity. It's just not there. There's one deleted scene with children. It was deleted. And they had a small part in the scene anyway. So that's something that you could raise questions about, but still the overall effect, of course, is marvelous.